Welcome to the third video in this series on learning how to learn, which is section 2 called Boosting Your Memory. So our focus today is on memory. Memory can be classified in lots of different ways, but we're going to focus on two primary types of memory, which are working memory and long-term memory. And we're also going to look at how to put pieces of information together so that they can be moved from one type of memory into another. You may be wondering why there is a photograph of chocolate here. And it's not just because I like chocolate, it's because chocolate comes in chunks. And chunking can also be used when studying or remembering, and we'll see why in a minute. But first, let's focus on memory itself. Do you recognize this game? The game is called Memory, and the aim is to look at it to see where the matching cards are, and then they're turned over and you have to remember where they are. The winner, of course, is the one who gets the most correct pairs. So, what type of thinking do you need to play this game Memory? Do you need focused or diffuse thinking? Just stop the video for a minute and think about it. Well, you need to be able to do two things really. You need to use your visual memory, your visual intelligence, if you like, so that you can recognize which of the pairs go together. But you also need to use your spatial intelligence so that you remember where they were when the cards are overturned. This means that you need to focus. You're using focused thinking, and what you focus on goes into what's known as your working memory. The working memory is only thought to have 4 slots, so you can only keep a certain amount of material, a certain amount of information in your working memory at any one time. This may seem to be inefficient, but actually it's extremely efficient, because what it means is that you only keep in your consciousness what you need for that point in time. But then if your brain decides that it's not important, it will be eliminated. This is why you can study something for an exam over and over again. You might keep that for the exam the next day, but then it'll disappear. Okay, so the other is long-term memory. Long-term memory is like a storeroom, an enormous storeroom, and it stores all those important memories that go up to make your experience. So when you remember a nursery rhyme or a song that you used to sing as a child, this is coming from your long-term memory. And the reason you can access it is either because you've sung that song so many times, or because it has some particular significance to you that makes it memorable. When we're studying, of course, what we really want to do is to get the information that's in the working memory into the information in the long-term memory. And how do we do that? Well, there are various ways. One is distributed practice, which we've already mentioned. So if you look at this video today, but then you look at it again on Saturday, you're telling your brain, this is important. Oh, do you remember about working memory and long-term memory? And it will reinforce that pinball, that red pinball track that we saw before, that little path that your thinking takes when you start thinking. So repetition, but distributed repetition is useful for moving information into the long-term memory. But chunking is also useful, and we'll have a look at that now. So chunking, as I said, chunks are pieces. So we all know chunks of chocolate are pieces of chocolate. When it comes to information, chunking means taking pieces of information and putting them together. If you think of language learning, for example, you might have words, but you can chunk them into phrases. So instead of remembering I'm frightened plus of plus spiders as three separate things, if you put them together, it becomes a chunk, and it's easier for you to remember the whole thing. I'm frightened of spiders, rather than remembering, oh, if I use frightened, I have to use the preposition of with it, and then a noun, spiders. So chunking is putting small pieces of information together. And when you do this, you lessen the cognitive load. I gave the example of learning a language, but it could be with anything. And those 4 slots that we just saw in the working memory can deal with chunks. So you're actually putting more information into your working memory, but you're doing it by chunking things together. These mini chunks can then be combined and they become part of the bigger picture, which we saw before. So to give you an example with this, let's go back to the idea of walking to work or traveling somewhere. So if you are in Philadelphia and you've never been here before, and you want to go from A and then to B and then maybe to C, the first time you go, you have to look at the map, you have to look at your Google directions, and you have to use focused thinking. You might notice what's around you, putting it into context, but you will be looking at every stage of the journey, and it will take you a bit longer. The next time you do this, you will remember some of these chunks, and so instead of having separate pieces of information, you actually put it all together and it becomes one smooth process. If you do this journey regularly, you don't even think about it at all. But what you're doing when you do it is not only looking at the specific points on the map, but you're also looking at everything around you. So you're putting it into context. Okay, so how do we create chunks? Well, first of all, you need to focus on the new stage in the journey, or the new stage on your learning, what you want to study. Second, you need to understand that. If you don't understand what you're studying, what you're focusing on, it will be very difficult to remember it. Third, develop the context by practicing. So if you understand your journey, you do it more than once, you notice the context around you, then it becomes easier. And you are creating the big picture in your long-term memory. So we go back to the big picture. The big picture in this case is your experience of life, or it could be your experience of traveling around Philadelphia, or it could be your experience of learning a new language. And the more chunks and mini chunks you have, the more you put them together. But, and this is a big but, studying chunks, understanding them, putting them together in your memory is only the first step, because after that, if you want these things to be relevant and you want your learning to actually take you somewhere, then you have to be able to apply that. So if you study the language, you need to remember the words, but then you need to be able to go out and use it. You might study if you're learning to play the piano, you might study the rules, but it's no good studying the rules if you can't sit down and create the music. So, to finish this little video, I want to talk about the illusion of competence, which I've mentioned before. The illusion of competence is when you think you've understood something, but actually you've just read it, and you may understand the grammar rule, for example, but can you go out and use that grammar rule? Can you use that language to actually communicate with someone? Well, this brings me to what I said before, that memory is only the first part. And I want to just talk very quickly about Bloom's taxonomy. which Bloom introduced in 1956, but it's still extremely relevant today. And he talked about lower order and higher order skills. We can see it here. Now, remembering is at the bottom of the pyramid, but this does not mean that it's not important. It's essential because it's actually quite broad. It's the basis on which everything else is built. Creating is the top, but that doesn't mean it's less important either. It's just that you remember information and you need to understand it. Once you understand how the rules and the vocabulary work, I'm going to stay with the language learning metaphor, then you can apply it. You can go out and talk to someone. Analysing will help you to understand when you can say something and when you can't say something. Evaluating will tell you what works or what doesn't. And creating is the highest order skill because you take something and you make it your own. You use that language that you've learned not to practice in an exercise in a classroom, but to go out and to communicate with the rest of the world. And this is learning something, transferring it into the bigger picture and making it your own. Thank you for watching the video. The next one is the last video, and we go on to think about motivation.